Hi everyone, Kevin from Total Endurance here. Just got some kind of interesting data a few months back. Just thought it'd be quite interesting now. We've kind of pulled some of it together just to kind of explain, certainly looking at fueling for a marathon as we get into the kind of marathon season, with kind of London and Edinburgh and whatnot coming up quite soon. So a couple of key things just to note, just the two runners that we're going to have a quick look at is, so it's both male runners, both aiming to run a marathon. So this was, when we did the testing, it was within six months before their marathon. It's probably only 2 or 3 now. Goal for both runners is aiming to run around about the 3:15 marathon pace. So again, they're pretty good runners. 7:25 per mile pace, or kind of around about 4:37 per kilometer pace. And the kind of protocol that we used to capture the data is 5 times 4 minutes, and we started at kind of 5:30 per k pace and got faster 1 kilometer per hour, so finished at kind of 16k an hour, which is 3:45 pace, or 3:45 per kilometer pace. I've excluded the last one just because it was quite a bit above kind of target pace, so it's kind of a little bit less relevant, but show you the kind of other points along that. So from that, from the data that we captured, so while we're measuring those kind of them running at those paces, we are measuring oxygen and also CO2 production. So it's how much oxygen they're consuming and how much CO2 that they're producing. And from that, we're able to kind of plot this graph. So generally speaking, is when you're consuming more oxygen than you're producing CO2, we're working more aerobically, meaning that we're converting fat for fuel, so our carbohydrate dependency is a little bit less, which is obviously what we want as endurance athletes. Or when we start to see the carbohydrate rate relative to oxygen start to rise, we start to burn more carbohydrates. So you get something called the respiratory exchange ratio, which is the ratio of those two, which I've excluded from this just now, but it's just basically the relationship between CO2 being produced to oxygen being consumed. But when we capture this into a bit more meaning, it's a bit more meaningful when we kind of plot on a graph like this. So the horizontal green bar there is kind of, generally speaking, maximum carb intake. So that's quite well researched and regarded as about the kind of range which is tolerable for most people to actually digest and consume. So that's roughly 60 to 90 grams per hour. There is studies showing that certain above that is doable, but it does depend on kind of the fueling option, and it's sometimes finding that balance individually. Certainly some people can tolerate more, some people kind of can't because of GI issues, and that often relates down to different types of carbohydrate being used, but we're not going into that today. So yeah, what we see with these two runners, so you've got the blue kind of line plotted here, which is kind of the first runner, and then the orange is the kind of second runner. And we can kind of see, so when they started the test at sort of 5:30 pace, both are generally pretty good at burning fat for fuel, so we see that they're kind of consuming oxygen quite comfortably, they're working kind of relatively low intensity, and carbohydrate metabolism is generally low. Now they're always burning some carbohydrate, not many people are exclusively burning fat as they start running. There's always a contribution in some regards, but as we go longer and then we go faster, the longer we can go while maintaining a lower carbohydrate metabolism rate, the better, and it does become a factor the longer the event goes. So as we increase the pace to 5 minute kilometers, so that's about 3 hour pace, and both these runners have ran sub 3:30, so we know that that's doable for both of them. And obviously they're trying to chip. I think runner one was like 3:25, runner 2 was a 3:20 in their last kind of marathon, so they're kind of trying to chip quite a bit off that, but not anything crazy. But the big change comes between the two runners when we go from that sort of 5 minute K pace to kind of 4:37, which is target pace. We start to see the amount of carbohydrate runner one needs to run that pace exponentially goes up. So they go from being roughly about 50 grams per hour to nearly 150, 160 grams per hour. So it's a huge swing just with that sort of 30 second increase in pace from that. And that really stands out quite as a big difference between the two runners, is just one runner's burning a lot more carbohydrates. So the fueling that's needed for runner one relative to runner two changes dramatically, and that can actually have a big impact on getting the race right and making sure that you can hit the target times without kind of running out of glycogen. And from that, so what we wanted to then use, take that data and put it into kind of glycogen depletion rate. So that's assuming that we start at about 300 grams of glycogen being stored within the muscles, in the liver and through the bloodstream. But now that's an assumption, it's different for everyone. and you're never going to completely deplete glycogen. Your body generally doesn't allow you to do it. You're more likely to be forced to slow down, and all the pain and hurt signals will start ramping up to protect you from doing that. And anyone who's ran a marathon or done a long run where they've hit the wall or kind of bonked, they know what that feels like. You start to feel hollow. It's not pleasant. You start to slow down, and it can certainly get quite dangerous if you go too deep into that. Now some people can go into that kind of level a little bit longer than others, and that sometimes is what changes. But for these two runners here, it's quite an interesting kind of trend to see the difference between the graphs. So the dots kind of represent the rate that glycogen is being used. So we start to be burning through our glycogen stores when we exceed that kind of sort of 60 grams per hour. Or with no fueling, we're straight away tapping into that. So when we look at the first one, at the blue dots there, straight away they start running. We're not taking on any external glycogen. So we're starting to kind of burn through our stores, and basically this is calculating that once they get to about 2 hours, that's where they're kind of hitting zero. That's when they're going to have to stop, and probably before that, probably in the kind of when they get to about 50 grams or less, they're going to start noticeably struggling and start to noticeably slow down. And worth noting that this both the graphs I'm going to show you here are done at their marathon pace. So if we were to look at the same graph for runner 1 at sort of that 5:30 or 5-minute K pace, it looks a lot different. It looks a lot better, but because this is target pace, this is what we're kind of interested in. And then when we go to 40 grams per hour, so the red dots, we start to see that we can extend that point by maybe about an hour, 30 minutes an hour. So it does help, but it's still not going to be enough to get us over the marathon distance. We're going to start to struggle around about 2-hour marathon pace, which is usually the big issue for most people. And I think this runner actually did comment that was one of their issues, and why they wanted to kind of look at some data was that when they get to 20 miles in training, or having previously, that's when they really start to notice there's a big difference in just the effort. The legs start to hurt. Now that's probably true for everyone who trains for marathon. It's 20 miles is that kind of holy grail distance to get to before the kind of race, but what often happens there, you'll get to that kind of 2 hour, and even if you're starting to run out of glycogen, you might get through 2 hours, but if you've still got another sort of 10K or 6 miles to run, you don't want to be getting close to glycogen depletion in 2 hours, and I'll touch on that in a second. But if we increase this runner's fueling to 60 grams per hour, we start to be looking at kind of getting close to kind of the target distance before glycogen depletion becomes a big factor. But it's touch and go for 60 grams per hour whether they can run 3 hours 15 without running out of glycogen. But when we exceed that again and go to 80 grams, which is still at the upper range of what should be tolerable, the likelihood of running out of glycogen is exponentially less. So their ability to get to the end of the race before they start to run out of glycogen is looking more likely, and certainly is going to help them. So I would say to this runner is, if they want to run 3:15, now that's not impacting their training, that's not telling them what they need to go and do and train, that's just saying from a fueling standpoint, they need to be eating roughly 80 grams or certainly 70 grams and certainly more than 60 grams if they want to run 3:15. Anything less than that, and it's a bit of a kind of a guess and a hope, and you certainly don't want to be relying, if you put in a lot of work to train to get to race day fit and healthy, that running out of glycogen and poor fueling options is the thing that limits you. But if we compare runner 1 to runner 2 again, so runner 2 definitely better at burning fat for fuel and conserving carbs, you can see there that even with no fueling, their ability to run that pace is actually not limited by glycogen depletion. So you can see it doesn't really change that much. So even at no fueling, potentially could run 4+ hours. And that's because their ability to burn fat is generally better. So they're conserving that carbohydrate being utilised. And it probably means that this particular runner could potentially run faster, certainly from a fueling standpoint. Now, I'm not saying that this runner should maybe go and try and run 3:15 without taking on any board fuel, but theoretically it's possible. But they probably want to be able to, or certainly enjoy the run a little bit more by taking in some fuel, but the need for fueling is definitely less, and they don't need to be eating 80 grams per hour. Now, if they're going to go and run, say, an ultra, they need to maybe increase that, but generally speaking, they're pretty efficient, so they can probably run quite a long time before glycogen depletion starts to be a factor for this particular runner. Say certainly we'd be aiming at sort of 50-60 grams still as a general rule of thumb. 2 to 3 gels per hour is certainly not going to do them any harm. But it potentially means that they could run faster. Now, if you look at some of the data for when they run at sort of 3:10, 3:05 and maybe 3 hour pace, still again we're starting to see glycogen depletion isn't really a factor. It certainly is starting to get more of an issue, but it's not an issue generally speaking. But if we want to kind of look at those two runners as a comparison, like the difference between if you're one or the other is that runner one will need to eat at least 60 grams, and I would suggest definitely higher than that to reduce the likelihood of hitting the wall, because if they stick to 60 grams, it's again maybe a bit of a hope. Runner two can be a bit more relaxed on nutrition targets, and also that faster marathon times aren't limited by their rate of glycogen depletion, so they can potentially increase the speed without seeing it become a factor. And I would suggest runner two can probably run faster than a 3:15 marathon just on the data that we got. But one of the things that comes back to kind of what they can do, and I say this was like 6 months out from their marathon, so it certainly there was time to do it, is runner one should ultimately focus on building their aerobic engine more than necessarily trying to run faster, because again, their speed's probably not their limiter. They can run relatively fast, but the issue they have is that their aerobic system is not as efficient as it could be, and it's not as well developed as it could be, and it's certainly not as well developed as runner two's is. And you might find that's the big difference between them, as runner two is actually just a more aerobic conditioning rather than runner one, who's maybe physiologically a fitter person or stronger athlete, but runner two has better aerobic conditioning from that, which allows them, as the distance goes longer, to actually be able to maintain a pace better. So yeah, runner one, I'd be saying go out and run, longer steady runs, gradually getting more efficient at burning fat for fuel and working on training the aerobic system more than necessarily trying to chase faster paces. That's going to have a bigger return or improve their ability to run 3:15 a little bit easier, or run fast in 3:15, because as soon as you start going above that, we hit maybe above 80 grams per hour glycogen depletion rates, and they can't even take in that fuel, and they might not even be able to take in 80 grams. That also needs to be trained as well. So it's definitely improving the aerobic system is definitely more important. But knowing your glycogen depletion rates kind of at your kind of target pace can be beneficial before you start training, because I think like the two runners that we're using as examples, both of them generally want to improve. So 3:15 is a good kind of improvement if you're coming from 3:25, 3:20 or 3:30. But if you're runner one, if you know up front that the amount of glycogen that you're depleting or the amount of carbs that you're using is quite high, you can spend the first block of your marathon training to develop your aerobic conditioning a little bit more. So rather than the traditional 6 miles at marathon pace, 8 miles at marathon pace, 10, 12 and so forth, up till you kind of hit up that kind of peak kind of volume, knowing that how much glycogen you're burning and the kind of energy system that you're using can actually help you massively, because you can then go out and, rather than try and necessarily run 6 miles at marathon pace, you want to maybe start off running slower and get better at using the aerobic system, and then gradually improving your ability to burn fat for fuel and reducing carbohydrate metabolism can have a big impact in there. And say generally if you find someone starts with that standard 6 miles, 8 miles, 10 miles, 12 miles, what might happen certainly if you're runner one, and it's what they kind of had done in the past, is that they got to 20 miles and noticeably started to kind of feel it. And if that's you might have been gradually building up, you're holding the pace, it feels great, it's comfortable, and you might not find out that you're starting to run out of glycogen until you hit 20 miles in. And once you get to that point, you're probably a few weeks out from the race. It's too late to change it. It's going to be quite difficult to jump from eating 60 grams per hour to eating 80 grams, and you might not be able to kind of adapt to it quick enough. Now, some people can, but if you know that in advance, and you know, right, I need to be at least on my training runs as I start doing marathon pace, eating more carbohydrate, or also making sure that you can spend the time to develop the aerobic system so that you can sustain that pace without running out of glycogen. So I hope that was interesting. I certainly found it quite interesting just looking at data between two runners, and certainly comparably two runners kind of running the same kind of target times and coming from kind of similar levels. It's quite interesting, but hope that's kind of interesting. If anybody's got any questions, feel free just to give us a shout, and yeah, hope there's something you can take from it.